I reached out to Julia Ioffe in August when I heard her discussing Zelensky-Trump politics on the Brian Lehrer show on local public radio. She mentioned she had a new book coming out this fall. That book, Motherland, A Feminist History of Modern Russia, recently became a finalist for a National Book Award and was just published this week. As you can tell, I just found it riveting, and I'm not even taking a test on it. You may have read Julia's work in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New Republic, Politico, the Atlantic. She appears on TV often as a Russian expert, MSNBC, CBS, PBS. She's a top-notch journalist, and her book is a reportorial tour de force. But what makes this book great is its approach to history, digging into Russia's past through the lens of women's lives and issues, the feminist promise that failed. The book is also a memoir that in a lot of ways has overtones of classic Russian novels, where great philosophical questions of good and evil unspool against the backdrop of political turmoil and personal upheaval. We have a lot to discuss. Welcome, Julia.
Hello, good afternoon. Thank you so much for the very kind intro, Julie.
Well,
picking the book up.
I'll hold it up if you tell me, although you have it on the shelf, which is really good without all the Post-it notes. I like this, Julia. Very nice. So, Julia, the American Jewish Historical Society has produced an excellent podcast series called The Wreckage, which has been examining the Jewish diaspora after World War II. The current season, season 3, looks at the Cold War, culminating with the huge wave of immigration to US from the Soviet Union. You can listen to it right now, wherever you get your podcasts. Your family was part of that wave. Before we just dive into the book, because this is also part of the book, could you tell us about what it was like for you as a young child coming to the US from the Soviet Union in the late 1980s?
Sure. So I was 7 when we arrived in the US on April 28th, 1990, and that is a date that we celebrate every year as a family. And we arrived in suburban Maryland, where my dad's cousin had a cousin who had also had a cousin. So basically chain migration. But I actually didn't know a lot or understand a lot about kind of the historical processes that shaped that migration and why some people had gone through Rome or Vienna, why some people went to Israel, and why we went straight to Dulles Airport in DC without making a stop in Rome or Vienna until I read Gal Beckerman's excellent book, When They Come For Us, We'll Be Gone. And it taught me a lot about my own family's history. My father had always wanted to leave Russia. He couldn't stand the constant anti-Semitism that barred him from certain schools and professions. For those of you who don't know, you could have excellent grades and just still, it was kind of like Jews need not apply to most universities. And he told me he went to the Gubkin Oil and Gas Institute, which was one of the few universities that accepted Jews, especially those who were good at math and science, like he was. And he said on his first day of class, he looked around the auditorium and it was just clearly Jewish faces everywhere, because that was where everybody congregated or where everybody ended up. And that one kid looked around and goes, well, now they're going to turn on the gas.
Oh, God.
That such was the humor. The institutionalized anti-Semitism radically shaped my family's lives in terms of life paths, career paths. The fact that I live in the US, that I'm speaking English, that I wrote this book in English is a direct result of that policy of state anti-Semitism. I was told when I was in preschool, don't tell anyone that you're Jewish, which I was like, okay, but now I realize, with my face and my last name, I don't know that I needed telling anyone. My teacher in first grade in Moscow was quite cruel to me, and I couldn't understand why until my parents were like, it's because you're the only Jewish kid in the class. Um, and yeah, it was when you're a kid, you don't quite understand what this is all about. When I came to the US and ended up in Jewish day schools, first at a Solomon Schechter, I met a few other kids who were like me, and they hadn't been told at all by their parents that they were Jewish until they were safely in the US, which I thought was wild even at the time. Um, and the families that welcomed us in Columbia, Maryland, who were members of the Temple Isaiah Synagogue, were incredible. And they really helped us get settled, help my father find a job, help my mom um, find courses that would help her get recertified, take the medical school board exam. And the Jewish community really, really pitched in to help. They were amazing.
So thank you for that. Even as you're talking, there's so many contradictions, right? Like there were so few opportunities for Jews, but your mom was a doctor, like that.
Well,
And
yeah, but I don't know if you read that part in the book, but um, she was going to medical school. She didn't want to go to medical school. She didn't want to be a doctor, but she had gone to a French school. Actually, as I learned later, one door down from Spaso House, which is where the American ambassador lives in Moscow. And she graduated high school with straight A's, a red diploma, gold medal, top of her class, and she wanted to be a French translator, but the Institute of Foreign Languages didn't accept Jews because to be a translator, you have to work with foreigners, you have to travel abroad, and Jews were seen as disloyal, again, this trope of double loyalty. And obviously, there were a lot of Jews defecting at the time, so keeping them from going abroad was crucial to that. So she wasn't allowed to even apply. Uh, and my grandmother had become a doctor. Uh, she entered medical school right before the doctor's plot, which was Stalin's idea, kind of one last hurrah that Jewish doctors were poisoning their patients and should all be rounded up and arrested. And basically, my grandmother and great grandmother convinced my mom that medicine would be the path for her. That is not a path she wanted, but it was the one she had to take because of anti-Semitism. Then, with her grades, she applied to the first medical institute in Moscow and didn't get in because she was Jewish. Like they purposely flunked her on the entrance exam. So she had to apply and spend her first year of medical school in Smolensk, which is this backwater in Western Russia, near Belarus, and then quietly transfer into a medical school in Moscow. And even then, she graduated at the top of her class, and she did not have her choice of residency. She was relegated she wasn't allowed to continue her studies after that. She wasn't allowed to pick a specialty. She was relegated to otolaryngology, which was considered a very lowly specialty in the Soviet Union. So it was this constant kind of bending of both her and my father's life and my grandparents' lives that, your choices in life were drastically curtailed because there were many avenues that just weren't open to Jewish people.
so, yes, so then I have to ask you, and I wonder also how your parents felt about this. You chose a career or created a career for yourself that took you right back into the belly of the beast, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, this isn't a therapy session, but I am curious to know because I have to say that throughout your book there is this I don't know if affection is the right word, but there's definitely this pull towards Russia. You feel it so palpably throughout and frustration over all the things that might have been. And so I think that, I guess, I, when did you start feeling like that? You were so young when you came here. And I know some people come, my parents were immigrants, Holocaust survivors, and my mom's attitude was, I don't want to, you know, that's
Mhm.
done. This is here now. I don't want to go back there. But, and I really didn't want to ever because of that attitude. And I wonder, what do you think propelled you into this career where you're now the Russia expert on every place?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that's also my parents. They wanted nothing to do with the place. But at the same time, that contradiction was always present in our home. They didn't want anything to do with the place, but at the same time, it was like, you're an heir to this culture, and we want you to read these books, and we're going to get you a Russian tutor. And every Friday afternoon, after a full week of school, you're going to spend 45 minutes with her on grammar and 45 minutes on literature. And we're going to make sure you know the language, and we're going to introduce you to all these great books. And uh, when I got to college, I was, of course, interested in this stuff because I had gotten it at home. And my parents were like, okay, no, but not like that. And they were mollified by the fact that I originally was pre-med and I was going to be a doctor like all the women in my family. But then I was just not great at science. And, uh, but at the same time, I would take a Soviet history class or a Russian poetry class, and that was seen as acceptable because it was kind of on the side. But when I decided to drop the pre-med stuff, and when I found Stephen Kotkin's Soviet history class just so transformational, it completely changed how I understood my parents, my grandparents, what I learned at home about Soviet history. Um, and I had always been drawn to history. I wanted to major in history and with Russian history as a sub-focus. They were horrified, and they thought, and then they were like, okay, well, maybe you can be a lawyer. You can play around with this, get it out of your system in college, and then you can be a lawyer and have a decent career. I think it wasn't just the focus on Russia, it was also the journalism, because what was journalism in the Soviet Union? Right? It was stenography, hagiography, and for them associated with a kind of bohemian lifestyle. And I remember now I think, like, what an incredibly feminist statement. But I remember my dad pulling me aside when I was 25, I want to say, and saying, okay, this is fine when you're in your 20s and you're having fun and going to all these salons, but what are you going to do when you're 30 and you have a family to feed? You can't lead this bohemian lifestyle. It was only later that I was like, oh, the assumption there, the unspoken assumption was that I would be the breadwinner.
Oh, yeah. Interesting. Well, after reading your book, I think I understand why he might have had that assumption, not your family in particular, but in Russia. Um,
Exactly.
so, so this brings me to the question. You said that your agent came up with the idea for this book. And I loved the way you wrote about how she had said to you, I think she looked at your family and your mother's a doctor, your grand, you come from a long line of women who one might think are exceptional. And you were saying, well, in Russia, not so much. And so if you could just tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book, because it's a pretty riveting way, and must have been, and we'll talk about that too, very complicated way to tell a story and to research.
I mean, that's how we do things. It's
Yeah.
just ass backwards. I I mean, I really resisted this idea for a long time. I think in part because in Russia, when I moved back, which again, my parents hated, and then I dated a Russian guy, and they were apoplectic because they thought I would move back and just start my life, start a family etc., and put down roots in Russia, and they were just absolutely horrified. I didn't. But
But were you even thinking about it at the time?
no, but I wasn't thinking too far ahead. I was just, I was in my
Yeah.
20s.
Yeah.
So when I lived in Russia, I knew people who, they were family friends with the Solzhenitsyns. And my grandmother, for example, was friends with one of the people who had come out. This is in the book as well, who had come out in 1968, one of the people who came out to protest the tanks in Prague in 1968. She was friends with people who truly did have exceptional lives in the Soviet Union, who were part of the people who made the history in the Soviet Union. And my family just didn't. They were just very ordinary people. Yes, some of them were parts of the intelligentsia, but I was just like, I truly don't know what I would write. It would be a very short book. And I do still think that if you just cropped out and collated just the chapters about just my family, it would be a short book. Um, but also I realized that to explain how something that seemed extraordinary to an American or a Westerner was perfectly ordinary where I come from, to bridge that gap of understanding, I would have to explain how this all came about. And then I realized, okay, so how did this come about? So I go back and I start reading, and I'm like, oh my God, I didn't know any of this. I knew that, everybody worked, and I knew that a lot of doctors were women, and scientists and engineers were women, and, STEM fields weren't considered super masculine or inhospitable to women where I come from. Um, but I realized that I didn't know the answer. And so this book is also me learning about this stuff. I didn't know who Alexandra Kollontai was. I didn't know who Inessa Armand was. I didn't know most of this stuff. And I realized that, but I also didn't want to do a very dry history. And I wanted to write my publisher wanted me to keep my family in it. So I had to devise a narrative structure to do both, to tell the big history of this experiment, to answer that question for an American or a Western reader, to answer the question for myself, which was, how did Russia go from the vanguard of world feminism, legalizing abortion in 1920 and having nearly 1 million young women fight in active combat against the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union? How did they go from that to what I saw in Moscow, which was this constant obsession with marrying an oligarch or marrying somebody rich who would just allow you to be a housewife, which was also so different from my family. And the idea for the narrative structure came from a conversation with Nina Khrushcheva, who is Nikita Khrushchev's great granddaughter. And she's actually a professor at the New School and a tremendous friend. She also helped me think of the title.
Which
But
is a nice play on Mother Russia. I like that.
yeah, we were just sitting there, what could it be, this? Could it be that? And then we came up with that. So when I first met her and was interviewing her for this book about her grandmother, she said, and this line is in the book as well, she said, have you noticed that if you look at the first ladies of the Soviet Union, their fate always reflects the fate of the country at large? And it was kind of an aha moment where I realized I could use the women at the top, the wives or the daughters of the leaders at the very top, to tell the big history. How did this experiment come about? What influenced it? What were the policies? How did it evolve and change and get betrayed? And then to tell the history of how it felt to live through that history, or I would use my family and some other people who weren't known names, to explain or to show how it felt to live through one of the craziest social experiments that humanity has ever conducted. And that kind of, and yeah, it was really hard to do, to kind of
Right. And I wanted you to talk
back and
about it because just so the audience knows, a lot of the chapters are just the name name of somebody, their first name.
yeah.
And some of those people are famous people or somewhat famous people, or their husbands were famous people, and others are ordinary people. But yeah, so I guess I mean, you sort of indicated how you started choosing the subjects, the first
Well,
ladies or the powerful people, but what was the research like? Because what's great about the book is it's got all this historic detail, and but it's also, and I mean this as a highest compliment, it's gossipy, like, and it's full of this, high level emotion, Stalin jumping in the grave of his wife's tomb, and then Svetlana herself is such a crazy um, character, Frank Lloyd Wright. I mean, there's just so many weird byways and highways, but how did you, I mean, yes, in the book you can see that you interviewed a lot of people, but was there a lot of archival research to do as well, or did you rely on memoirs, or what did you look at? How did you get to it, to
um,
these juicy details?
a lot of it came from secondary sources. A lot of it came from periodicals from the time. A lot of it came from interviews and kind of my family's personal archive. But I realized that to tell 150 years of uh, Soviet and Russian history, I wouldn't be able to, delve into the archives for every single thing. To tell the top line history, I would have to just kind of um, just rely on the secondary sources. But even that, there isn't a lot. When I started researching, I basically just bought all the books on the subject I could find, and I found that they filled up just one shelf in my library.
Wow.
They were all kind of very academic and, Russian or Soviet women from, 1928 to 1934, very segmented, very academic, very, very interesting, but very dry. And I was just recalling I'm here in the offices of Harper Collins, and I was just recalling with my editor that uh, my first editor on this book, who moved to a different publishing house, when she read a very early draft, was like, "What is this?" And then the conversation moved on. We were talking about what we're reading, and I'm just casually mentioned that I don't really read nonfiction for fun. That I read mostly novels, mostly fiction. And she was like, "Okay, that makes sense. Then I see what you're doing here."
Yeah, and it does have that pulse of a novel, which is what makes it, um, so riveting, actually, because these stories have such life to them and the people really have life. And one thing I was thinking about, it's very moving to me that your interviews with your grandmas, and if you could talk about that as well. And also just give us a little bit of a time frame, because you went to Russia the first time and lived there, I guess, in the when was that
I
exactly?
moved there in 2009 and moved back in 2012, and then I was going all the time to
Back
report.
and forth,
Yeah.
back and forth. Yeah. So I want to, well, two things. One, I want to talk for you to talk about the interviews with your grandparents, because that must have been quite an incredible experience for you as a person and a reporter, if I can divide those two things. And then also, I was thinking about it that there's a lot of people who are, I think, roughly your generation, Evan Gershkovich of the Wall Street Journal, who was jailed for his reporting, and Masha Gessen, and a lot others who are very similar to you, or they came here with their parents, and I'm sure their parents had become a doctor or something else, but don't go back to Russia. And then they all became reporters, and poor Evan ended up in jail for quite a
Yeah,
while.
when Evan was arrested, my parents were so upset. They were like, "This was always our worst nightmare for you."
Yeah, I'm
Um,
sure.
you know,
So
to
when,
to
yeah,
completely uproot your life so that your kids have a better life outside of Russia, for the kid to then go back and get swallowed up by the machine that you were trying to take him from is, I can now understand, is a parent's worst nightmare. But just real quick about the novelistic question.
Yeah.
I didn't really want to study literature ever in college. I always wanted to study history. And for me, history was, um, and it was the same when my parents would travel with us. They were obsessed with traveling after being trapped behind the Iron Curtain for the first 30 years of their lives. Every year we would go on one big trip to Europe and just see every cathedral, every museum, like every monument. And we would be in debt for months afterwards, but it was just so important to them to see all these places. And for me, in those travels and in learning history in school, it was always about the stories and how compelling the stories were, and that they were in some ways better than the stories people invented in novels. Uh,
Yes.
Not just stranger than fiction, but just more interesting and more and crazy. And I always imagined myself, like my make-believe games were like, what would it have felt like to live in these times? What would it have felt like to experience these things? And um, when I discovered Svetlana Alexievich, I had never heard of her until she won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2015, and I picked up Secondhand Time. I had never heard of her. She started off as a journalist, and I don't know if you've read her stuff, but it's, Secondhand Time is about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and she interviews probably hundreds of people and condenses the interviews into these short monologues. And I found it completely revelatory, and I was like, this is what I wanted. This, because it was, how does it feel to live through historical cataclysm? I had always wondered that about my grandmothers, my great-grandmothers, and I always felt that was missing in the history books, because I think there's this idea, and we all know who came up with it, that emotion isn't a valid form of information and is not an interesting form of information. There's this delusion that humans are rational actors, and that decisions are made rationally, and that cold, clinical, rational writing is what is good writing. And I would get that feedback as a young reporter from elder male colleagues, or even sources who were like, we like that piece that is not so emotional. And I just felt like those emotion is important. Emotion is how a lot of decisions get made. Um, Emotion is so central to all of our lives. It's central to I mean, I'm also a very just like deeply emotional person. But and to me, that was one of the most interesting aspects of history. And it was also, I could feel it when I interviewed my grandmothers. Um,
Yes. And those stories. So I guess one of the things
mm,
that,
and sorry, let me just tell you quickly about the experience of interviewing my
yes, thank
grandmother.
you. I know and get back.
Two radically different experiences, and I just remember complaining to my parents at the time, because one grandmother, Emma, was, I mean, she was a fascinating, vivacious woman, but had a touch of narcissism to her. And when I tried to interview her, it was all about how amazing and exceptional she was, and how this person she came in contact just loved her and thought she was a genius. And she would go on these long, you know, it was all about preening for me. And it would take, these interviews lasted for hours, but they were incredibly frustrating a lot of times, because I was like, can you just tell me what happened? And she wrote down some of her recollections herself, and they were also just full of bluster and posture and thin on information. My paternal grandmother was incredibly stoic and unemotional, but also just couldn't remember anything. And she was, or she could, but she couldn't remember anything about herself, but she remembered every detail about the neighbor's cousin and how the neighbor's cousin married this person who worked at this factory and had moved there from this town, and their cousin. And I was like, I don't give a shit. Come on, can you just fucking focus? I'm sorry, it was just so frustrating. And I remember complaining to my parents, where I was like, why couldn't I have gotten one normal grandmother? If you can combine them, maybe I'd get one normal interview. So they were quite challenging interview subjects. I had to really pan for gold with both of them.
I love that. Before we go on, I was just thinking as you were talking about living in Russia. I mean, I realized that I have traveled many, many places, never to Russia for a variety of reasons. And
Is that where your family's from?
no, it's a good question. They were from Eastern Czechoslovakia, but and all I heard growing up was how the Ukrainians were, not the best, and so on and so forth. And then, of course, after the war, they were from Ukraine, and so it's very interesting. The way the boundaries shift all the time there, as we know, and but what was it like for you as an American Russian living in Russia when you were living there? Was it fun? What was it like just day to day? I mean, you were involved with a Russian guy there. What did he do? I mean, just I was trying to imagine that part of it.
It was so much fun. It
So
was so
much
much fun.
fun.
It was it was the best kind of Never Never Land. I was in
And
I was in my late 20s. I was in a place that was incredibly interesting, that I knew enough about where I could pass as a local. I still had a lot of family and friends there, and but was enough of an outsider. So the locals were like, "You're really American," and here people say, "No, you're so Russian." Um, and I could I could access it in a way that other Western journalists couldn't always, and I could translate it for an American audience in a different way. And I was witnessing what we now realize was this brief thaw, this brief window of seeming possibility. And, we would be up all night at this bar called Jean-Jacques, or named after Rousseau. And it had these red walls, and the food and the wine were cheap. And you'd be in there till 6 a.m. drinking wine, smoking cigarettes, debating whether Russia has the right conditions to be a democracy, and what does it mean to be a journalist in a society like this. And, Boris Nemtsov would stroll through, and Navalny would come through, and you'd sit and talk with them for hours. And it just felt you were just in the thick of something really important and significant and meaningful. And there was this crazy energy to it. I mean, it was truly, New York is a sleepy city by comparison. Moscow was truly the city that never sleeps. I mean, there were 24-hour tanning salons and 24-hour nail salons, and um, our nights out regularly ended at 8 or 9 a.m. Um, and it was just absolutely intoxicating. And then at the same time, I had a blue passport. I wasn't a Russian citizen. And I knew at the end of the day that I wouldn't have to make my life there, that I would never have to have my kids educated in those schools. I'd never have to get treatment at Russian hospitals, which were a disaster. Um, like I could always, if things got hairy, I could always get on a plane and go home to my nice American democracy, which is why this moment feels so deeply unnerving, because now it feels like there's no place to go.
Right. I mean, I have to say there were many times in your book when I was getting which I get a lot nowadays, but like panic attacks,
Oh
because
no.
so
Why?
much
Which one?
Well,
Which
because
part?
I think what you were just saying, because I think a lot of things you were talking about, all these rights that people had, and and even the part, and so much of the loss of that felt like, are we in the middle of that right now? And so actually, it was also interesting when you were writing about sort of I guess I was so struck starting after World War II at the disappearance of Russian men from the landscape, both physically, they were all killed, so many of them by Stalin and by the war, but also just as people in the world, the
Mhm.
alcoholism and all of that. And I was thinking of the crisis of young men that they're talking about here all the time. And it was starting to feel very parallel. And I guess the question I want to know, how did these two powerful nations with very different histories and very different backgrounds, but end up in the control of billionaires, men who are autocratic, anti-liberal people? It's kind of, is that, I mean, I know that's probably beyond the scope of your book, but I just wonder, but
But
it's
it's
also
not.
exactly what it's about.
It is. I think because at the end of the day, while Russia attempted this experiment, it was never full-hearted because the men were still in charge. And I thought it was so interesting that the Bolsheviks were the most egalitarian of all the radical parties while they were in the underground, when they had no real power and they were just, like us in the cafes debating these things that had no kind of practical impact when they were all theoretical. And then the second they take power, they're like, okay, the men have to be in charge, right? And they weren't super interested in emancipating women fully. They were fine with emancipating them so that they could be laborers because the country needed it. But I think you see that in the U.S. too, where let's emancipate women, but not too much,
Mhm.
and the set and not truly, because once you really emancipate women, and it's like, oh, there are more of them in the universities, and they're outperforming men in the workforce, and they're if there's a level playing field, they're winning. Sometimes they're like, that's no, then all of a sudden we start talking about a crisis of masculinity because for some reason, women's emancipation in the minds of men leads to a crisis of masculinity because their definition of masculinity is that the men are in charge.
Yes.
And anything that undermines that cannot be allowed and has to crack and cannot allow anything else. I think this kind of traditionalist revenge about, men are men and women are women and the men are in charge, I think always comes along with repressive politics in every other sphere.
Uh-huh. And uh, well, do you see any way to get out of this path that we seem to be on? I mean, obviously the Russian history was quite different, right? It was a revolution. And, I also have this thought, they came from a Tsarist background, which had this autocratic leader. And then in a lot of ways, the Soviet Union just kind of mirrored that. And now I guess Putin wants to return to that.
They didn't really ever have a long enough stretch with democracy. And one of my friends, Michael Idoff, who's also a tremendous author and writer, once said, if you think about it, between Tsarist Russia, Soviet Russia, Putin's Russia, it's all the system of government is basically an autocratic, repressive bureaucracy built around imperial bureaucracy built around an autocratic cult of personality. It's just that the kind of the cover is always a little different. He was like, listen, that's three. That's enough for New York Times trend story.
It's true.
uh, so um, there's that. But at the same time, that I feel like that explanation goes out the window now because what's our excuse? What's America's excuse? We had
Correct.
50 years of it, and I don't know, Black people got a little too much power, and there was some inflation after the pandemic, and so fuck democracy. And
Well,
so
I think it's
maybe
been
it's not tied to how whether you've had any experience with democracy or not.
Um, honestly, I don't know. This is so, I would have given you a million different kind of thoughts and suppositions um, 5 years ago, but now it's all so crazy that it's really hard to know what's going on. But I guess at some level, you hope sanity will prevail, or what we think of as sanity. At some point, you don't have an expression of hopefulness, but you have to because you have a child now. You're forced to optimism.
Well, I do keep saying that it feels like I had a child in 1933, but I'm sorry, I'm not. Again, I've just read too much history and have seen, in part through the study of that, what human beings are capable of. And if you think about the long arc of history, these moments of peace and prosperity and the flowering of the arts, they are few and far